Thank you very much for the introduction. So I was already presented. My name is Margarita Alexandrova. I'm a postdoc at the University of Luxembourg. And this work was done in collaboration with the professor Oleg Chertov from National Technical University of Ukraine, Igor Sikorsky KPI. And it was financed by a European funded project called Cities 2030. I would like to start with a bit of introduction and why conformal learning can be interesting, very interesting in practical applications. So we already have our traditional machine learning framework that results in so-called point predictions, that is one class label for in case of classification or one value in case of regression. And these models are usually accompanied with some test accuracy, which of course we want to increase, but it is not possible to do so. However, in some practical applications, it might be very important to be confident in the results of our predictions. And conformal prediction gives us the necessary solution. For any user-specified error rate, like here, for example, 5%, the conformal predictive model is guaranteed to build a predictive model with the required accuracy. So in this case, the accuracy will be 95%. This is done, however, at the price of a reduction in model precision. That is, instead of a point prediction, such a model generates region prediction. So it will be a set of class labels for classification or a numerical interval for regression. However, the required accuracy is guaranteed. So this is a plus. How does conformal learning work? And here I will be talking in particular about inductive conformal prediction setup. On this schema, you can see the traditional machine learning prediction framework. So we have our data set that is usually split into training and the test parts. Then we use the training data set to build our predictive model. And after that, we test it on our test data set and we do our predictions. Conformal learning framework is a bit more complicated, in particular ICP framework. So we further split our training data set into proper training data set and the calibration data set. The proper training data set is then used to build the predictive model as before, and the calibration data set together with the model is used to estimate the calibration scores. The two important parameters of conformal learning framework are the user-specified error rate epsilon or significance level and the nonconformity function. A nonconformity function is a function that is meant to measure nonconformity or the strangeness of every point in our data set. And it is used both to estimate the calibration scores and on the prediction step. The theory guarantees that all conformal learning models will have a bounded error rate that is specified by the value of epsilon given by the user. That is why comparing conformal predictive frameworks doesn't make sense using accuracy framework. That is why different measures are used. In case of classification, such measures are 1C and average C. For example, these are those that are widely used. So what is the idea? We know that the accuracy is guaranteed. However, we might get the region prediction that might contain more than one label, more than one value. So we would want to minimize the length of the prediction set. In case of classification, we can measure this as 1C, that is the fraction of singleton predictions, and this value is to be maximized. We want to have as many singleton predictions as possible. Or another metric, average C, that measures the average size of the prediction set. And naturally, we would want to minimize this label. A simple calculation example presented here at the bottom of the slide shows how the values of these metrics are calculated. So here we have 4 data points, and for 2 of them, we generated singleton predictions. These are the data point 2 and 3. So from this example, the value of 1C will be number of singleton predictions, that is 2, over the total number of points in the data set, that is 4. So the value of 1C will be 0.5. The value of average C in this case will be 2. So on average, we predict 2 labels per data point. A recent study that is cited at the bottom of this slide revealed an interesting relationship between these efficiency metrics and the choice of the nonconformity functions that was used to build the model. In particular, the authors showed that using margin usually results in higher values of average C, as presented here. And using inverse probability usually results in lower values of average C. This study was done using various artificial neural network-based classifiers with 21 real data sets from the UCI machine learning repository. And it was shown that the results are statistically significant. The aim of this study is to further develop these results. The questions that we are interested in are the following. Will the same relationship be observed for other classifiers, for other classification models? What would be the impact of the data set difficulty on the efficiency of conformal classifiers? And finally, of course, it sounds very tempting to try to combine the properties of margin and inverse probability. It is try to build a conformal classifier that would both maximize 1C and minimize the average C. So this is what we try to tackle in the third question. A small note that after the submission of this work, we extended a little bit the results. So the new results are highlighted in, will be highlighted in green color in this presentation. I will start with the presentation of our proposed approach of how we can combine the properties of margin and inverse probability. First, a little bit of motivation. Of course, we would want to have a minimum size of the prediction interval. So the property of providing the smallest value of average C given by the inverse probability function is very good. And then we would want to enhance this model with the singleton predictions that are provided with the margin inverse probability functions. So what we propose to do? We propose to build 2 conformal models at the same time. One will be based on inverse probability nonconformity function, and it will use the value of significance specified by the user. And another will use margin nonconformity function and will use the value of significance 2 times less. Why is it done? Because we want to take only those singleton predictions in which we are sure. After that, the outputs of these 2 models are analyzed. If the results produced by margin is a singleton and the result produced by inverse probability is not, then we take the results produced by margin. This is this branch. Otherwise, the result produced by inverse probability are taken. This combination that we also refer to as IPM is not technically a nonconformity function. However, we would refer to it as a nonconformity function just for the simplicity of explanations. And it can be considered as something like improved version of inverse probability function. Indeed, it has exactly the same output as inverse probability, with the only difference that some non-singleton predictions are replaced with the singletons, resulting from the application of margin nonconformity function. So in case the validity holds, this can be considered as sort of an improved version of inverse probability. About experimental setup, we used almost the same experimental setup as the original study, sorry. So we had 10 by 10 fold cross validation. 90% of the data set was used for training, with the split on proper training and calibration in the proportion 4:1. The rest, 10% of the data, was used for test. We used 8 different classification models. They are support vector machines, decision trees, k-nearest neighbors classifier, AdaBoost, Gaussian neighborhood process, multi-layer perceptron, random forest, and quadratic discriminant analysis. We also analyzed 5 different values of significance level or error rate, ranging from 1% to 20%. Next, we took 9 representative data sets from those 21 data sets that were used in the original study. And we also artificially generated some synthetic data sets to have a control over difficulty and to be able to track how the difficulty might impact the efficiency of conformal classifiers. How these data sets are constructed, these synthetic data sets? They are essentially constructed as a set of points normally distributed around 4 centers on a 2D plane, like this. And by increasing the value of the standard deviation, we can obtain classes that overlap more and more, thus resulting in a more difficult for the classifiers data sets. We start the presentation of the experimental results, of course, with the analysis of validity. Validity is by default, and it is proven for proper nonconformity functions, such as inverse probability, presented in this column, and margin presented in this column, and the same for the synthetic data sets. However, it will not necessarily hold for their combination APM, just because of the way it was constructed. However, our results show that it indeed holds both for real and for synthetic data sets. And this can be explained by the fact that we changed the output produced by the inverse probability function and replaced the non-singleton predictions with the singletons only when we were very sure in the output of a conformal classifier based on margin, because we used the value of epsilon 2 times less than the one specified by the user. Now we'll discuss the relationship that we observed in the dataset. For the majority of the cases, we indeed confirmed the relationship that was observed in the original study. That is, margin resulting in higher values of 1C and inverse probability that is presented in as a yellow line, resulting in lower values of average C. Additionally, as expected, the IPM approach can be considered as an improvement of IP, that is resulting in the lowest values of average C and middle values of 1C. However, we also observed some interesting deviations. In particular, in some cases, margin can be the best choice of nonconformity function, resulting both in the best values of 1C and in the best values of average C. And this was observed for all classifiers with the balanced data set and for KNN classifier, regardless of the data set. At the same time, inverse probability is rarely the best choice of the nonconformity function. It was observed only for some small values of epsilon. Finally, in some cases, our proposed approach, IPM, resulted in the best nonconformal classifiers in terms of both metrics as presented on these images. So we have IPM presented with orange line, resulting in the highest values of 1C and in the lowest values of average C. And this was observed for glass data set with multi-layer perceptron classifier and with cars and wave data sets with random forests. Now we'll have a slightly deeper look at the results that I presented on the previous slide. So here we have 2 tables. The first one presents the patterns observed for real data sets, and another one, the patterns that were observed for synthetic data sets. Each column corresponds to a data set, and in the rows we have various patterns. The first thing that we can observe, the first row corresponds to the cases when margin is the base classifier. And we can clearly see that KNN is almost always prefers margin nonconformity function. The only exception is the wave data set. Also, we can notice that for balanced data set, almost all classifiers, again, performed the best with margin. This is also the case for synthetic data set, what can be seen here. The only exception is the data set that is the least difficult, that with the classes that are clearly separable, and essentially all nonconformity functions perform the same for this data set. The pattern when inverse probability is the best nonconformity functions was observed only for real data set and only in these two cases with other classifier and only for some individual values of epsilon. This line corresponds to the cases when inverse IPM approach resulted in the best performance, and we see it happened for glass, cars, and wave data sets with a particular classification algorithms. And finally, for all cases, IPM is sort of improved version as IP. It never performs worse than IP in terms of both metrics. The similar observation can be essentially observed for synthetic data sets as well, with the only exception that for synthetic data set, in one case, we observed an inverse pattern, that is inverse probability resulting in higher values of 1C and margin resulting in lower values of average C. And this was observed only for one data set that is the least difficult, so the classes are easily separable, and it was observed for those values of epsilon that are very high. So they are essentially, it is very difficult to build classifiers for such an easy data set with such a high error rate. So this observation could be considered rather an exception as a rule than as a rule. Next, we present our analysis of the relationship between difficulty of the data sets or the efficiency of the classifiers and the efficiency of the conformal learning model. We observed that usually easy data sets, or when the baseline classifier performs good, in these cases, it doesn't matter which nonconformity function is chosen. It doesn't matter because we can see essentially they produce all the same results. Also, when the difficulty grows, this difference becomes more evident as presented, for example, on this slide. We have here two synthetic data sets. The first one with clearly separable classes and the most difficult where the classes overlap the most. This is again presented in more details in these two tables, one for real data set and another for synthetic data set. The second row shows the median value of the baseline error of the underlying classification model for different data sets. And we can see that it is the lowest here and it is very high at the end. And the same as expected for synthetic data sets, this median error grows with the difficulty of the data set. The two last rows show in which percentage of the setups we observed either threshold difference between different nonconformity functions, and the threshold we used 2% of the relative deviation, or statistically significant difference. And these values are represented here. And essentially what we can observe that for easy data sets, we observe very little difference, in very limited number of cases, the difference between nonconformity functions was observed. And at the same time, when the data sets were difficult or the classifiers didn't perform well, we observe this difference much more often. And the same pattern is essentially present for synthetic data sets. We have very small values here and large values here. And the last point of our experimental evaluation, we observed that the baseline accuracy of the classification model, that is accuracy in the traditional machine learning prediction, point prediction, correlates significantly with the efficiency of 1C metric. And the efficiency of 1C metric, we understand the proportion of singletons that essentially contain the true label. And to illustrate this, we present the following two tables. Again, the first row indicates the median value of the baseline error for different data sets. And the second row, in particular, the last row, shows the value of the correlation between the accuracy and the effectiveness of 1C metric, that is the fraction of correct singleton predictions. We can observe that in many cases, this correlation is very high, over 0.8. In some other cases, it is also quite high, reaching 0.78 or 0.69, so almost 0.7. And in case of real data set, we observed only one deviation for one data set, then the correlation was as low as 0.27.
5 minutes left.
Yes, thank you. And essentially the same observed for synthetic data set. We can see that correlation is always high, always above 0.5. And here I will conclude my work. So the main question of our work was to see if the same pattern will be observed for other classifiers, and indeed it was. However, we also found some deviations. For example, margin can be the best choice for some classifiers and for some data sets. We also observed that the nonconformity, the efficiency of the nonconformity functions depends on the accuracy of the baseline classifier and how easy the data set is. And the effectiveness of 1C metric can be sort of predicted from the baseline performance of the classifier, and we can evaluate if we should use this metric or not. The code and results are available using the following link. As for the future works, it can be interested to extend our research with the similar analysis for other metrics, such as adaptiveness, for example. Also, it can be interesting to try to explain what can be the reason of the deviations. Is it dataset specific, classifier specific, and what should be the properties to exhibit such deviations? And finally, I would like to improve our approach of combining margin and inverse probability in more theoretically grounded way. Thank you for your attention. That's all.